Welcome, everybody, here in Filene Auditorium in Moore Hall on the campus of Dartmouth College, and those joining us on Zoom webinar as well today. I'm Bob Coates. I'm the Assistant Director at the Nelson Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and run the center's internship program. I ran environmental and conservation internships for college undergraduates for many years with a national nonprofit organization called the Student Conservation Association, and found my first job out of college on Capitol Hill through an internship. Welcome to How to Land an Internship, co-sponsored by the Rockefeller Center at Dartmouth, Dartmouth Center for Professional Development, and Hamilton Place Strategies. Before we get started, a couple of Zoom details. For our virtual attendees today, please ask your questions at any time by using the Q&A button in Zoom. And here's an insider's tip. The earlier you ask a question, the greater likelihood that it will get answered. Our Rockefeller Center student program assistant here today, is she up there? No. Shadi Miravanazan will ask the questions that you submit virtually through Zoom for us today. For those in Filene, in order that your question is heard, for those on Zoom, please step to a microphone in either aisle to ask your question. To access Zoom's closed captioning feature, navigate to live transcript and select show subtitle. If you don't see that option, look under the more button. It's usually there. And if you didn't have time to sign up in the back of the room on your way in, please do so. You'll make Joanne Blay very happy. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel, three folks who have considerable experience with internships: Matt McDonald, Chandlee Bryan, and Sasha Kokoshinskiy. And let me start with Matt, who is coming to us from his work headquarters at Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Matt. Matt is a partner in Hamilton Place Strategies, a consultancy in Washington that works on public debates of economic policy issues. Matt works with a range of clients on multiple issues and industries, including finance, technology, education, and energy. Matt also runs the firm's recruiting program. HPS runs on-campus recruiting every fall, hires about a half dozen paid interns every summer, and currently has 6 Dartmouth alums at the firm. Prior to HPS, Matt was a consultant for McKinsey in New York and in their Washington offices. Previously, Matt has also worked in the Bush White House, as well as serving as an advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger, Senator McCain, and Governor Romney. Matt is a Dartmouth class of 2000, where he was an economics major, and he later got his MBA at MIT. Great. To my far left, Chandlee Bryan is the Assistant Director at Dartmouth's Undergraduate Career Office, the Center for Professional Development. Her past experience includes facilitating a job search club in Manhattan at the height of the 2008 recession, serving as the resume writing specialist for a national Microsoft campaign for new grads, and working as the national young member liaison for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Thank you, Chandlee.
Thank you.
And then to my immediate left, Sasha Kokoshinskiy hails from Boulder, Colorado, and plans on pursuing a double major in applied mathematics and economics at Dartmouth with a minor in public policy. Although originally a 22, class of 22, Sasha is now a 23, as he took a gap year for the 2021 academic school year. During that time, Sasha worked a number of different virtual internships in a variety of sectors and industries, including an economic think tank, a private equity firm, a management consulting company, and a legal center. This summer, Sasha is living in Hanover and is working for a professional services and accounting firm. So welcome to all three of you, and I really thank you all for being here today. Let me start with a question to the three of you and ask you to take 5 or 6 minutes to share with us what your best overview and overall advice is on how to land an internship, and to do so sort of from your perspective, from your experience in terms of how you see success in finding an internship. And let's start with Matt in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Bob. So I guess my top tip on
landing an internship, and this is really from my perspective on the recruiting side, not any of the internships that I had back in the day. But I would say the big thing to me is to approach it as a volume play. Is like identify as many places as you can that would be interesting and apply as much as you can. So I would not approach it as an exercise of falling in love with the perfect spot. I would, identify as many spots as you possibly can. Every Dartmouth grad is going to benefit from the brand and benefit from people being interested in talking to you. I would say the more places that you can discover, the better. So, as an example of that, if you're looking at internships in Washington, D.C., if you go to Google Maps, center it on the White House and search for institute or association or something like that, there's going to be like 25 things that'll pop up within a block's radius, right? There's plenty of places that exist, but I think the problem and the bias is that a lot of people in this room have probably heard of like Brookings, but like there's the Institute for Peace, there's the Institute for War, there's every conceivable kind of association, think tank. There's just, that you can't swing a dead cat without hitting one of these things in Washington. The problem from Hanover is that you don't necessarily know what all those are. So building out that big list of all the places that are possible, I think is helpful for success. Because if you find yourself in the zone of like, oh, here's the handful of places, the half dozen places that I think would be great, they may or may not have internships, they may or may not be hiring, it may or may not work out through no fault of yours, but just there's a bit of randomness to the exercise. And so I would say, go big on volume, and you may find something that you discover that you didn't even know that could be really interesting. And so I would say do that. And then the other piece is don't overlook small organizations that might not have the brand, but that you might actually learn a lot and be able to do some real hands-on work, because that will be valuable experience, and it'll be stuff that you can speak to in a more in like full-time interviewing and that sort of thing. That can be really good.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Sasha? Yeah, I'm gonna move my...
I guess just to add on to Matt's point about applying to a lot of different places, I think the most important thing here is not to get discouraged. These past 5 terms, I applied to over 100 different places. And so every email you get, you sort of have your heart sink a little bit deeper. You feel more incompetent as an individual. But I think that just the most important thing here is just to have your head sort of stay up high. Obviously, something that is important to know is that it only takes one place to succeed and for one sort of cycle to actually finish for you to sort of land an internship. So I think that's something that sort of you never need to forget. Something that I do also want to note here is that sort of as Dartmouth students, I think we have access to a variety of different resources, but we oftentimes don't know what those are, and they're sort of underappreciated and sort of underused. Here at Dartmouth, obviously, we have a number of different resources within the stacks, 7 million's worth, but that's something that we're not obviously going to go through. And I think that that is something that's also worthy to know in terms of internships. This past year, I actually used sort of 5 different methods in order to secure the 5 different internships that I had. The first of which was the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy. Then there was the Dickey Center for International Understanding. I also secured an internship through the Dartmouth Center for Social Impact. Then I also secured a different one through Dartmouth's CPD, or Center for Professional Development. And then the last one was secured sort of through more general recruiting that wasn't Dartmouth specific. So I think that it's important to recognize that even though you might feel restricted to one specific avenue, there's always sort of a different path you can take. Within the past year, I think I've spoken to sort of 10 parents of just some of my close friends. So definitely feel free to use the resources that you have available to you. I think the alum network that we have is also something that is sort of underappreciated and underused. And sort of within the Dartmouth alumni database, that's something that's very easy to access and sort of very easy to utilize. So I think it's just important to recognize the sort of access to resources that you do have, but actually making sure that you use those and use them to your advantage.
Okay, so I represent one of 4 career coaches at the Center for Professional Development. And the biggest piece of advice that I can give you is not to go through this process alone. And this may be one of the loneliest periods in your Dartmouth experience if you are currently going through our recruiting program. Because right now, a lot of people that I talk with, spoke with 4 students this afternoon, 3 this morning, 6 yesterday, and I'll speak with another 7 or 8 tomorrow. We'll feel like the positions currently listed on Handshake, our online portal, are the only positions that are available for internships next summer. And I actually want to start with something that I believe Bob said in his introduction, speaking about Matt, that Matt will be here in the fall to recruit for half a dozen interns at his company or his organization alone. So I want you to hold that with you right now, regardless of what you're interested in. Timing is everything in this process, and knowing when individual employers are looking is a critical question. And I believe Catherine has some slides to show. And so one of my, again, my first point is timing is everything. And you can find employer contact information on our student portal. And I'll be showing you some of that information today. It is really important to educate employers about the Dplan. When we talk about internships at Dartmouth, it's a unique experience from other schools. A lot of schools who are on the semester system, employers understand that spring term often refers from January to May, right? Here at Dartmouth, we know that spring term is this odd period of time, which isn't really spring in Hanover, because spring only lasts about 4 days, but it's mid-March to June. And so one of the things that you need to do if you're looking for a spring internship or a winter internship is to educate employers about that specific piece. And I'm going to give you a tool today that you can use as you talk about that process. So timing is really important. The next thing, which is really critical, as Sasha mentioned, is networking. So it can help you really across the internship process. And I want you to even look around the room or look around the Zoom in terms of who's present, because you can literally network at all levels. So if you're sitting next to someone, they can have a potential lead for you if you tell them what you're looking for. If you're asking someone in the library for assistance, they can give you tips and resources. A lot of it is about asking open-ended questions, and your leads can really come from anywhere. My favorite version of thinking about networking comes from an author named Keith Rossi, who has a great book called Who's Got Your Back? And he talks about 3 different levels of connections you can have. You can have your peers, which are he calls your lifelines. You can have mentors or people who are 3 to 5 years ahead of you or farther along in their career. And you can also have heroes. I went to college with Amy Coney Barrett. And she was, when she got nominated for the Supreme Court, I thought, oh, she must have majored in something harder. We have the same advisor. We were the same major. So really think about, what are your aspirational goals? If you could do anything in the world, what would it be? And study how other people got to that resource. I'm going to share with you 3 general resources today. The first is a brief tour of Handshake, our new student portal. I want to share with you our student leave term database, which has over 1,300 shared experiences of what past Dartmouth students have done. And if you're taking that spring or winter internship, you can see what people have done in the past. And in many cases, you can also get contact information for those individual employers and reach out and say, hey, I understand you had a Dartmouth winter intern in the past. Would you be interested in an application from me? So you can be that direct in some cases. And I also want to talk to you about the subscription resources available through Dartmouth. The college literally spends millions of dollars getting you access to amazing information. And I'm going to share with you a couple of my favorite tips with that. But I'm going to start with Handshake. So this is our new CPD student portal. We rolled it out in late May. And the really amazing thing about Handshake is that it increased the number of opportunities that the CPD is able to list directly for you by about tenfold. So you'll see a lot more positions in there. If you look under the jobs piece, you can filter by internship and by location. And under employer information, you can also see contact information, including students at Dartmouth and other places who've interned for that employer in the past. So there are ways to network on Handshake that you didn't have access to before. In terms of finding information from the CPD, if you're used to Dartboard and you haven't logged into Handshake yet, you can find all of our old resources under the our how-to resources under our resource library. Next slide, please. So right here under the Career Center. And in terms of networking, again, from student to student, when you look at employers, you can search for specific organizations. You can see Q&As, and you can see contact information for organizations. Sometimes they won't, if an employer doesn't have their own individual email to write to, you can reach out to students who've interned for them in the past. And to make it easy for you, there are templates that are designed for outreach that you can just customize a little bit and get in touch with people. So there are a lot of times you can use that as a best practice for your search. Many years ago, I was working with a student who wanted to intern at the Guggenheim in Venice. She was an art history major, and that was her dream internship. She actually went on to LinkedIn. She didn't have Handshake. She went on to LinkedIn. She found an intern, a past intern at the Guggenheim in Venice. She contacted her, even though she didn't go to her school. They were able to get together for coffee in New York City. The networking contact offered to introduce her to the director. Fast forward, Talia just finished a 4-year fellowship program or 3-year fellowship program at MoMA in New York, and is now getting a PhD in Great Britain in art history. So really just a simple thing that helped her launch her career. And it was just all about sort of student to student networking. In terms of reaching out to employers on Handshake, if you feel awkward at any point in the process, that is my job. I really need to stay employed. So we want you to use our services and take advantage of our coaching appointments. And we are also available to you throughout the process. Even if you get an offer and someone says you need to accept it by the end of the day tomorrow and you're not sure how to handle it, we are here to help you with that. So please reach out to us. Next slide, please. And I think I shared a little bit of information about this, but as well, this is how to find contact information. We are sending everyone who signed in today on Zoom and in person a complete copy of the slide deck so that you have access to information. Next slide, please. This is our leave term database that I mentioned earlier. You can find it in the Career Center on Handshake and under resources and opportunities. And this is a way to search for what other people have done in the past. It's a really underutilized tool, and we encourage you to not only use it as part of your search, but also to share information with us afterwards about what you've done so that you can be a resource for future students. And again, we're happy to share that with you. Next slide, please. And again, 1,300 peer reviewed. You can search by location, and the tabs at the bottom of the spreadsheet allow you to search by term. So it's really useful for that. And next slide. And finally, I wanted to share with you some tools. Again, I mentioned the resource library. One of the resources that doesn't get used enough that I can't recommend give any more just credibility to is our research resources. And our reference librarians are amazing. Matt mentioned the importance of trade associations and nonprofits. You can find those in GuideStar by location and by area. You can look at them by assets. How much money do they have? That often tells you whether or not they're likely to be able to afford to pay you for an internship, or if you're going to need to submit a funding application to Rocky or Dickey or CPD. And there is funding available. You can always apply for opportunities. But the resources are very, very helpful. If you are looking for an internship in Washington, I especially recommend the public policy and government resources. We have think tank information. And one of my final slides coming up is a research resource that we have called Leadership Federal Leadership Congress. And through Leadership Federal Leadership Congress, you can literally see for any office in government as much contact information as they have available. So you can see the chief of staff for congressional offices. You can search by Dartmouth College, and I think I have an illustration of that in my next slide. And you can see, again, who our alumni are, where they are, and you can find their contact information. I don't recommend that you send a note to Senator Portman or Gillibrand directly asking about a summer internship because they have a lot on their plate, but you can always send a note to their legislative staff. Mm-hmm. And one thing that Bob reiterated when we spoke initially about internships is how important it is when you're looking to kind of be nonpartisan in some of your approach as well, because everyone in any congressional office, there's staff that are willing to help you no matter what your affiliations are.
That's correct. Yeah. Great.
So thank
Wonderful.
you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Obviously, CPD with lots of resource to take advantage of. I wanted to just touch on a couple of things. One, looking at Sasha, your gap year career this past year points out the availability of opportunities at various centers on campus. So much like the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, if you're interested in a public policy internship, we have funding. Obviously, each center has its set of eligibility requirements for the internships, and you make an application to each center. But to take advantage, research the centers in terms of the areas that you're interested in. They vary, and we certainly do collaborate, but to take advantage of that. The other was just in terms of timing, which Matt mentioned and you mentioned, Chandlee, that for some internships, you really do need to start very early. I know that we get applications to the Rockefeller Center for funding for internships with major federal agencies, and the U.S. State Department. Those kinds of federal internships, the deadlines for applications to those agencies is very early. State Department could be as early as January 1st for the following summer. So to consider the timing is depending on the agency or the organization is to be aware of their deadlines. So let's kick off a little bit of a conversation here. I've got a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions. Virtual questions on Zoom and questions from the room here in the auditorium. I was going to go back to Matt. I wanted to go back to Matt and ask him, Matt, digging sort of deeper into the research and preparatory work needed to successfully apply for and be accepted into an internship. If you're just starting out, perhaps you're pursuing your first internship. What would you say are some of those critical initial key steps to lay the groundwork for successful acceptance into an internship?
I mean, I would say, think about some of the stuff that we just heard in terms of the volume play, the kind of flattening of resources and that sort of stuff, and just the amount of opportunity that's out there that prospective interns all across the country have access to, is that one of the reasons that college application, why like the Dartmouth admittance rate is like a quarter of what it was when I applied, is that, when I applied, people applied to like 6 schools, and now people apply to more than that. Now, mathematically, that just means that even if you have the same people playing musical chairs or speed dating or whatever it is, acceptance rates are going to go down. So part of what you want to think about from an internship perspective, and the same thing applies when you think about just the volume of resources, the access that everybody has to what's out there, is that the corollary to the volume, the corollary to the research, is doing your homework on the individual organization, what they are looking for and what they are about. So our internship, our fall recruiting is for the full-time positions. Our interns is intern applications are typically January before that summer. For intern applications last January, even with COVID and all the rest of this stuff, I think we had like 700 to 800 applications, right? Now, like there's gonna be places where whatever, you're gonna be a fit, or you're gonna have some experience that will be relevant to the place that you're applying. But it does really matter to reach out with like a personal attention, or or like do your homework in terms of your cover letter and tailoring your resume and all the rest of the stuff. And the reason for that is because when you think about our side of it, right, speaking from the employer perspective on this, how do you decide between candidates that on the surface are pretty much the same, right? You can chop off resumes with that volume and say, okay, well, these 50, these 100 look pretty good, but I've got, whatever, 5 slots, a dozen slots, whatever the organization is thinking about. And it matters if you reach out with that extra effort to indicate interest, right? Because part of the problem from the employer side is like, okay, well, these people look good, but if I go and they don't want to be interviewing all day, every day through 50 people to find interns. So, like if they've got 5 internships, maybe they want to interview 10 people or something like that. That means that those 10 people, they have to have some confidence that if they extend an internship offer, that person is actually going to accept it, and they're not going to be wiped out. Well, to make sure that doesn't happen, like indications of interest, personal outreach, paying attention to do not put the wrong firm's name in a cover letter, right? Like just don't do that, right? But when you think about these things, that with the volume play also comes the aspect of like a little bit of prioritization. It's not like you have to write, a new specially crafted cover letter for all 100 places that you're applying to or whatever, but you do want to prioritize things that you are really interested in, that you really want to do, and you want to do personal outreach through email, through networking, and you want to pay attention to, if you go and have a informational coffee with someone, reference that in the cover letter. Like the person reviewing your resume and your application may not know that you did that. I had a conversation with so-and-so, this really spoke to me and what I'm interested in. So I would say the corollary to all the volume play and all the technology resources that have opened up a lot more possibilities is that you need to do your homework, and you need to figure out ways, both explicitly and implicitly, to convey your interest in the experience that's on offer at the places you're looking at.
Terrific. Thank you. All right, Sasha, I got one for you. I often say to those applying for Rockefeller Center funded internships that the value of a college internship is the ability to explore career sectors of interest and get real world working experience in those fields while applying their academic skills within those organizations. What do you say to the possible outcome of a successful internship in a field that you determine is definitely not for you? Which is to say, have you had that experience where you felt like it was a successful internship in that it revealed perhaps something that you didn't want to do when thinking about your future career?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I would say that I definitely felt that a few times this year. I will not be naming the internships at which I felt that way. But I think that the important thing to realize is that sort of each internship that you have is a learning opportunity, regardless of whether or not you like it. And ultimately, if you don't end up sort of liking the work ethic or the sort of corporate environment at a certain place, that can ultimately sort of help you determine where you actually want to be. I know that this past year in the internships that I didn't like, I was essentially able to not only cross off those industries off of the list of sort of what I want to pursue after graduation, but it also sort of helped me cross off other sectors that are similar in that vein. So even though I didn't sort of like those internships specifically in that sort of specific time frame, either because I didn't sort of like the work environment, or I just didn't see the impact of my work through to fruition, or there was just another aspect of it that I didn't sort of quote unquote vibe with. I think it's important to realize that you can learn anything from any internship, and that sort of even if you don't enjoy it, there's things that you can still take out of it. So I think that's all I'll say in that regard.
Bob, can I add to that?
Yeah, you sure can, Mike. Go ahead.
I mean, one thing that I think is important to understand or think about, and this came up in a podcast series we did on getting a job in DC with associates here at HPS, is that it's very difficult from the outside to understand what the culture of an organization is, how the teams work, what the norms are, that sort of thing, right? So like we're just talking about of like industries is, hopefully you have some sense of industries, but there's an opportunity to explore. I think one of the things to really think about, and this is hard to know from the outside, but as you get an internship and as you proceed in an internship, think about what it is about that organization that you like or don't like, right? What are the norms in terms of management? What does it feel like in terms of transparency? What is the expectations and opportunities for training and that sort of stuff? That is the type of stuff that can make or break your experience once you have a full-time job, that is very difficult to test for from the outside. But after you get a flavor of that in an internship, it's something to really pay attention to for full-time recruiting. And so it's not something that I would necessarily solve around, but that type of self-insight into this is the kind of organization that I want to work in longer term is really, really valuable to get out of an internship.
Terrific. Thank you, Chandlee. One of my last questions to you, given our emergence into something of a post-pandemic world and the return of in-person internships, I know for the fall, the Rockefeller Center and other centers at Dartmouth will be back offering in-person internships at companies and agencies. How are organizations looking at their return to in-person? And would that mean is there specific advice on applying for and securing an internship in this sort of post-remote or post-virtual internship world? What, if anything, do you think has changed with internships? I don't know if in talking to host organizations and companies, they're coming at it any differently than they were pre-pandemic.
I think there's a lot more openness towards remote internships, and there are a lot more remote positions that exist. I think a lot of, for this next year, I think we're going to see a lot of hybrid opportunities. I've talked to some people this summer even who've said, I had never expected to spend my junior summer in my high school bedroom, working in my dream internship on the computer, but I'm told that I might get to go meet with people in person for the last week. So in some cases there are modifications happening.
Mm-hmm.
I know yesterday we got the news that our 2022 All Ivy Environmental Career Fair, which is hosted by Columbia University, is going to be virtual again, and we hope to go back to in person in 2023. I anticipate that a lot of our events over the next year will be a combination of virtual and in person as people sort of figure this out. I think the benefit to that is in some ways, if you are working remote, you need to be very strong on communication. And Matt, I'd be interested in some of your perspective on that and be exceptionally good at communication. But you can also figure out, what are your best peak hours? As a student, you might know that you function best at night, and so you might be able to spend some time working on a project and not have your A game on if it's required the first thing in the morning. So figuring out kind of how to optimize your own performance would be one message. I think one thing that I'd underscore, no matter where you are, is to really think about Matt's question in some way about figuring out how to assess the culture. How do people relate to each other? How are people communicating? Learning how to write an email that is concise, that can be easily understood. But I'll never forget, a long time ago, I worked at Tailor, and one time I wrote my supervisor a long email with 3 different asks in a few days. I was very frustrated because I didn't get a response from her. And when I asked her about it a few days later, she said, oh my gosh, I keep meaning to go back to it, but you just asked so many things. It's so helpful if you send me an email for every individual topic you want to talk about and label it specifically. And at the time I was really annoyed. And since then I've found that it was a fabulous piece of advice and one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten. And I've used it ever since. And I find that I get much better responses from people doing that. So I would say being aware of self-aware and asking people for feedback is really critical during this time. Being flexible is important.
Mhm.
And also, finally, I think being really selfish with your interests. And by that, I mean, take the time to research what you want to do and go after the things that you're really curious about. And as Matt said, a little bit of investigation and showing somebody the level, if you can comment on something specifically on Hamilton Place Strategies website and a report that they did and how that correlates with one of your classes, you've got a much higher chance of getting on their interview list. Is that right? Is that fair?
Yeah, there's got to be like, there's got to be something in a context where, like, all else equal, there's plenty of qualified applicants, right? So like you want to figure out a way that you can distinguish yourself.
Great.
On the remote stuff, I mean, we're in person, but a lot of my clients are like optional return on Labor Day, mandatory return in January 2022. I think that has different implications if you're like, our summer internship program is really designed as a kind of first piece feeder into our full-time recruiting, right? So like our summer interns are basically only juniors, and our goal is to get to know them and hire them full-time, right? That's kind of our goal. So I think for us, with that explicit goal for the internship, and candidly for the interns, is that we're doing in-person internships this summer, but a remote internship in that context is a little tough on both ends. Like, as we all saw, like remote work, remote schooling is just not quite the same. And for us trying to assess fit, for them trying to get a calibration of like, is this the kind of place that I want to work? That's tough. I think communications is important just to make it successful. If it's not a internship that has an explicit tie to recruiting, the way that like some more formal firms or consulting or corporate stuff does, that probably has a little bit different implications about how you can think about remote and the flexibility that presents, right? Because that's the upside of remote. The downside is like you're not meeting people in person. It's tough to get calibration on some of those pieces. The upside is that you can do it from anywhere. And in terms of like hours in the day, if you negotiate, okay, well, this is the time that I can work, that it presents a lot of opportunities in that way. So that's the upside, right?
Great. We'd like to open it up to questions that you all may have here and or in Q&A. And should we check with Shadi to see if we got a question from our virtual audience?
Yeah, we do have one question here from Paul. He asks, what are some ways to go about looking for spring internships / opportunities? And guess adding on to that, an interesting tangent could be, what are the differences between finding a summer internship and maybe an internship during an off term during the year?
Well, I'll mention and then let others answer, just that we certainly see a cycle. I think the other centers do too, in terms of number of applications. Summer tends to be more popular than other terms. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. Others?
Spring traditionally at CPD is probably our lightest term, but there are still very good opportunities to be had. One of the things that I found was a strategy that really worked well during the pandemic is, instead of starting sometimes a conversation, if you're networking with someone and saying, do you have any spring internships between mid-March and June? To start with the question, what is your biggest problem? And how, and listening for the answer and really thinking it through. And if it's an area in which there's any remote possibility that you're able to help, sort of brainstorming and collaborating along with that. I had a student at the beginning of COVID who asked that question, and who I encouraged to ask that question after he was getting no responses, in May 2020, saying, do you have any summer internships? When people don't even know when it's going to be safe to go back to the office. And he came back a week later and said, I think I'm going to take a whole gap year, because that's the only way I can get all these things done. And they're really exciting potential initiatives. So sometimes starting, my advice would be to start sometimes that search with our leave term feedback database that I showed you earlier, and looking at past spring student experiences, and also just simply reaching out to people, having conversations and saying, I'm going to be taking what we call at Dartmouth a leave term, between mid-March and June. Might there be any opportunities to help you solve that problem during that time?
Great. Questions from you guys? All right. Thanks for going to the mic.
Yeah. So my question is, so I'm an athlete and I'm a fall athlete, and we have because of Dartmouth's schedule, we end a little bit later in the summer, but then I have to be back on campus very early for sports and stuff like that. And I can come back later, but the question is how do you navigate that? These sort of restrictions that the Dplan can kind of create, along with your own sort of restrictions. How do you navigate that when you're speaking to people and trying to get these summer internships that are maybe for a longer period of time than necessarily fit into your schedule?
That is a perfect question for our employer relations team, which you can email srs@dartmouth.edu. And one of the things that's coming up with Handshake right now is that a lot of schools who use it are on a different cycle. So they're looking for for interns who are available in early June. We always say, go ahead and apply and have that conversation at some point in the process, ideally when you get the offer. One student I worked with several years ago was hired for a position that was actually going to start less than 24 hours after she graduated from Dartmouth in New York. And she worked with us. We helped her craft an email message to the employer. The employer contacted her back, and they actually decided to delay the start date for all of their new full-time hires by 1 week. Because it gave them some additional information. I think for athletes too, sometimes also working with your alumni and your coach, because they often have a lot of contacts. And, I noticed from your shirt that you play rugby. So I know, for example, that there are some rugby alums, men and women, who are very, very invested in helping alumni connect, and who are going to be more than willing to give you some advice and possible opportunities as well.
From the employer perspective on that stuff, at the beginning of the summer is actually a bigger pain point than the end of the summer. And it's because what Chandlee was referencing, it's actually because you usually have some sort of, as an employer, you usually have some sort of onboarding program for the interns, and that requires some staff effort, and you don't want to do that multiple times. So you want to have everybody start at the same time. Dartmouth's end date of June versus a lot of schools are in May is actually more of a problem than athletics at the end of August. Nobody, listen, on some, I would go ahead with the applications and deal with it later. No the organization that you're applying to is not going to like rise or fall because you have to leave in middle of August versus the end of August. So it's not, that like if you're doing some sort of idiosyncratic research thing with some in particular person who wants specific dates, like that may become an issue, but I wouldn't worry about, especially the back end. The thing with Dartmouth is that the front end can be a little idiosyncratic, and most of the people who recruit at multiple schools will be aware of some of that stuff.
Something that I just briefly wanted to know is that at least throughout my gap year, the internships that were with Dartmouth alums were very sort of understanding of the Dplan. So they made recommendations in that regard. But also the firm that I'm currently at, it is a bigger firm. So they have like different start dates and different end dates. And one of the end dates is actually July 30th for some of the internships. So it really obviously depends on sort of the size of the firm and what they offer. But there definitely are options.
I would add, from the Rockefeller Center's end, we have eligibility requirements to determine a minimum length, but not a maximum. So I think from our end, there's flexibility. And I think as Matt said, my experience has been, you get accepted, you certainly can have the conversation with the organization, and more often than not, they're willing to work with you because they're working with schools that are on semester, some on terms. So I think they're used to having those kinds of conversations. Shadi, I wanted to go back to you to see if we had any other virtual questions.
Yeah, a question that we had, and I guess maybe all of you can answer or provide some insight on is, whether you're at 24 or 22, how can you leverage the experiences that you've had at Dartmouth or outside of Dartmouth in trying to land that internship of your choice? I feel like some people, sometimes there can be some imposter syndrome, or it can be difficult to, aggregate all your experiences into something, cohesive. What experiences have you all had, seeing the result of that, or producing that yourselves, that kind of representation?
I think one thing you can do is educate employers about the Dplan. It is a unique experience. I am also getting a master's degree at Dartmouth right now, and so I'm a student. And every now and then I've taken 2 winter term classes, and they are brutal. You guys do so much work in such a short time period, and you're synthesizing so much information. I mean, what other schools have midterms in the second week of the, second or third week of the term? You guys, that's like common practice. And that's something that when you're applying for an opportunity, you might be the only Dartmouth candidate. And so you should emphasize those experiences. And you know what? If you have a grade that didn't go very well at some point in time, you can also explain the Dplan to a potential employer and what you've learned about how to handle processing large quantities of information and providing insight. And I'd be interested in Matt's perspective on this as well.
Don't be afraid to tailor your resume, add stuff, leave stuff off. I mean, I'm gonna aside from my employer hat, like if I go back to my MBA days, and if you get your MBA resume prep is it's practically a class unto itself. And don't get hung up on some of the, there's an aspect to some of this that is a bit of a box checking exercise of you don't have to be, to participate in a club, you can put a club down. If you have, if there's something that is of substance that you are engaged in on campus, you can have that be a whole section unto itself that is relevant to a particular application. And I would say, if it's relevant, expand on it. And if it's not relevant, you don't even have to include it. So, I don't think that you should not think about your resume as it's not a CV of everything that you've ever done, right? It's not a self-biography. It's it's an encapsulation of the reasons why you are relevant and appropriate for the role that you're applying for. That's it. So, you don't want to, obviously don't lie on your resume, and you don't want to put stuff on there you didn't do, but the reverse of it is fine, is like excluding stuff that just doesn't make sense in the context of what you're applying for is probably the way to think about tailoring it. And on the imposter syndrome, listen, like one of the nice things is that when you get into the working world, you will realize how many incompetent people there really are out there, and you'll feel better about yourself, and it'll be fine.
Yeah, I guess just briefly, I think what's important here is just not forgetting to tailor sort of yourself for who you really are. You really don't want to sort of put up a facade of sort of what you're interested in. And sometimes it's okay to show sort of your niche. I know that on my resume, for example, I list contra dancing as one of my interests, and that comes up in every single interview. And so it's important to not just put yourself as this like professional brick. Like they don't want to be talking to a wall. They want to be talking to sort of a real human being. So show them that you do have other interests, that you're not sort of just this professional machine. So just make sure that you sort of consider that as well.
Got one last question from the virtual world. Shadi?
Yes. This question is from Gavin. Gavin asks, does anyone have any insight into specific internships in terms of scientific advising in government positions or public sector, such as EPA, FEMA, science and technology policy, et cetera?
I would just start by, those are certainly sectors that have, that Rockefeller Center interns have been placed in the past. So we have advising sessions available. You know, Sasha has an hour and a half a week, and we have 2 others. So would be to contact us, because we may have had previous interns there, and somebody that we could recommend to you to talk with sort of on an informational interview side in terms of pursuing that internship.
And at CPD, we have contacts in those areas as well. And I have a past intern who just finished up a 2-year fellowship, I believe, with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So, which was kind of a dream of hers. So, we can definitely help you research and identify those connections. Again, that's a perfect example of where Leadership Federal, Leadership Congress, and some of the subscription databases that Dartmouth has can really come in handy as well.
Great. Well, let's close this out. Any last thoughts that our panelists have? Send away guidance to the folks who attended via Zoom or here in person?
From a CPD perspective, we just love to work with you. And so please take advantage of our services, schedule an appointment via Handshake, and we hope to see you very soon.